Hey, how's it going? Mike from LI Flies Mike, and today we're going to be tying an interesting fly that we came up with on stream. Looking to tie something that falls somewhere in between a crab and a juvenile fluke or summer flounder fly. So today we're going to be tying the Cruke fly, and as always the full list of materials will be down in the description below. So starting off, we have the Umpqua Jig Hook here in the 60-degree bend. These are pretty heavy duty hooks, so they should be able to hand a pretty serious fish for the size. And using some fluorescent orange thread here, I'm going to build up some thread on the hook and then go ahead and get some dumbbell eyes to tie on here. These are painted brass eyes using some fluorescent orange paint that I was using for the mole crab flies or the sand flea flies, but they should work just fine for what we're trying to do here. I'm taking our thread and we're wrapping around the dumbbell eyes in a figure 8 pattern, but as well going around the base of the dumbbell eyes and securing it that way, just to give us an even more secure dumbbell eye. So now taking some lead wire here, this is a pretty thin diameter lead wire, so I'm going to triple or quadruple it up because it's much smaller than the usual 0.035 diameter lead wire I use. I'm just going to take this on here and tie a pretty decent amount. We just want to help ensure that the fly is going to sink as well as turn over, but it's just going to add some more weight so this fly has a little bit more of an exaggerated jigging motion and it sinks even faster. So just taking my thread here and covering up that lead wire to ensure that that's not going to go anywhere, and then taking a little super glue and applying it using the trick of the cardstock and spreading it around nice and evenly. It's going to dry quicker and we're ready to start tying the fly here essentially. So now taking ultra chenille, we're going to do something that I first found out when tying the strong arm merkin crab flies. And I found out first about that fly from David Skoke and him tying them, but essentially we're going to be taking this ultra chenille and making our own crab claw. By doubling it over and having two pieces, then tying a simple overhand knot, we'll essentially be able to form a makeshift crab claw. So you can see I'm doing that, and then the end I cut the loop, and you can see we essentially kind of end up with a jointed crab arm, if you will, similar to like the EP arms that you could buy in the past. Last step here to ensure that the chenille isn't going to unravel and to give us an even better crab-like appearance, we're going to take a lighter here and burn the end, giving us a nice natural taper. One thing to note is I ended up making another one because the first one, the joint was a little bit too close to where I wanted to tie it for the hook. So after remaking one to where the joint's a little bit more in the center, that second joint, I'm just going to go ahead and tie this in here, tying it right around, tying it a little bit behind where the hook point is. I'm not necessarily too worried about this getting ripped off or anything like that. I'm going to make sure it's secured with my thread and use some super glue. Now one little trick we could use here to make sure that this isn't going to foul on us. The chenille arm is pretty stiff, but just to ensure that it's not going to foul on us in any case, we're going to use some liquid fusion and apply it to this back section to stiffen up the crab arm. So now the main body of the crab fly here is something we've done a ton in the past. We're essentially going to take some Slinky Fiber and do some V-ties. Now previously I've used EP fiber. You could totally use EP fiber or some of your other favorite synthetic materials that work for V-ties and stuff like this. But for this particular fly, also trying to get the shape of a juvenile fluke, I think it's a little bit easier to use the Slinky Fiber. So taking some white Slinky Fiber for the belly and taking some darker brown Slinky Fiber for the top color, we're going to essentially tie these in here, tie them directly in the center, and then fold them back on the opposite side. So you have the material sitting offset on the hook. We have a ton of different videos explaining and showing the V-ties if you're interested. We have a pretty healthy amount of material on here, but one thing to note is we don't want too much material because it's easy to add too much material to a fly like this. But after getting the amount of material that I want, I'm going to go ahead and folding it back in the opposite direction and tying directly on top of it. We're able to now build a 3D profile by having the material tied off both sides. Something I'm going to do here is take my scissors and trim up the fly a little bit just so I don't have to deal with it later on. Now, trying to combine a fluke and a crab fly all in one, the Slinky Fiber can help give us the juvenile fluke appearance, but I did want to put some rubber legs in here. So we're going to take some Sili Legs here, and I'm just taking some tannish color Sili Legs that seem appropriate for this sort of pattern. And we're just going to tie them in on one side, fold it back, and ensure that the legs are tied on the sides of the fly. And now it's just a matter of continuing our V-ties forward. We're going to end up with about 3 or 4 V-ties before the Dumbell Eyes here. So moving on to our second V-tie here. Again, tying our material. One thing that I will note is I tend to put less material on the belly section just to ensure that A, there's not too much material on the fly, but also ensure that the fly is going to flip over properly. We do have heavy Dumbell Eyes there and some lead wire underneath, but it just helps having a little less material on the belly, so it's something to be conscious about when you're tying the fly. And I said we have about 3 ties or 4 ties here on the V-ties. As we're moving up the shank after each Slinky Fiber tie, we're going to tie a Sili Leg on either side to kind of help give us those crab legs. And I think even if you are targeting striped bass, for instance, or some other fish species on a juvenile flatfish, I think the rubber legs aren't going to necessarily hurt anything. They might even entice a bite. So now taking our Slinky Fiber ties here, the start of our V-ties, we're going to fold them back, and it doesn't really matter which side you start on, top or bottom. The most important thing is that your thread wraps don't favor one side, front or back. You want them to be even and perpendicular so that you get a nice even V-tie. So after tying our third tie here, we're going to take our Sili Legs and tie these on here, and we have just enough room to do one more light V-tie. But before we do that, we're going to add some nice coloration to try and imitate the gills. And this is the secret weapon of Henry Cowan, and I've started to adopt it in my tying as well, and that's using some hot pink Fluro Fibre. It's really special material that has some crazy light changing properties when it's in the water. But we're just going to put a small amount of this stuff here before the last V-tie, before the Dumbell Eye, and then that Slinky Fiber is going to kind of help it blend in and look like the gills on a almost translucent juvenile fluke. Now, one thing to note is once we move past the Dumbell Eye here, we're not really going to be able to tie any material on the belly. So this is our last belly tie here. So taking our materials and folding it back and wrapping on top here, and then moving our thread forward in front of the Dumbell Eye, we're ready to finish off our last couple V-ties on top. So now I'm mixing up some light tan and some brown color just to kind of mix it up. You could totally do that for the entire fly. I'm just kind of freestyling as I go here with the colors and the materials. But we're just lightening up the color a little bit for the head here. And we're going to be tying 2 more V-ties, just again on the top though, not the bottom, because the Dumbell Eyes themselves would provide an obstruction and push that material in an awkward way. You can do that, but it may end up interfering with how the fly swims. So finishing our last V-tie here. We're building up that last bit of material so where we can try and trim that juvenile fluke / crab shell pattern, or shape I should say. And after building up a little bit of a thread head just to make sure that it's durable and the thread tapers nicely, we're going to throw a couple whip finishes on here, and we're going to be ready to brush this fly out and start trimming it up. One thing I like to do before trimming and brushing is just kind of make sure the material is spread out properly. I'm just kind of taking the material and manipulating it by hand to make sure that the ties are where I want them. And after brushing the fly, I'm going to go ahead and start trimming the pattern here. Working on the belly and the top first, kind of starting the basis of the fluke pattern or the crab shell and the shape that I'm going for. And one thing to note here, as I was tying, I forgot the old trick, which I had my paper clip here. This is a paper organizing clip. So what I'm doing is I took the rubber legs and pulled them down, clipped them together. I'm using that as like a little handle. And now I'm able to trim the fly without cutting the rubber legs. Somewhere in between. So essentially what we're doing is we're just elongating a normal crab shape profile that we're tying for crab flies, and trying to get it somewhere in between where a, medium-sized juvenile fluke and a, let's say, a larger lady crab or calico crab or blue claw, for instance. And I think the tail off the back not only can give it a crab appearance, but also maybe the tail of a fluke or something. So you'll see the action in the water. It's kind of interesting how it reacts. So before we put some eyes on here, we're just going to take a Sharpie here and apply some camouflage or dotting with a black Sharpie. You could obviously use different colors, but fluke and flounders have very good camouflage depending on where they are. So even the juvenile ones can have some camouflage. So we're just going to try and break up the natural color a little bit with some Sharpie camouflage. So now taking some 3D eyes and some E6000, I believe these are 7/32, but you can use whatever size you see fits for the size juvenile fluke you're trying to imitate, or the baby fluke. And taking the 3D eyes and some E6000, I'm just going to smear some of that E6000 on there, build a little base, and then we can stick our eyes on top. Now, don't try and get too picky because there's only so much room to work with. You need the eyes to actually have some structure underneath, otherwise they will just fall off eventually. So as much as I'd like to get the eyes a little bit more off to the sides in the way that a fluke normally looks, I think this will work just fine. To be honest with you, if you don't even have the eyes, I think it's completely fine as well. It's generally more so just the shape and profile that we're trying to imitate that's the most important thing. Now taking some head cement and coating the thread head, as well as getting some of that head cement and coating the threads where the dumbbell eye meets the hook shank and where we wrapped on top. And one final quick trim here just to kind of get the final shape right. You can see the side profile. We are trying to kind of blend the line between a flat fish like a flounder and the rounded shell of a crab shell, for instance. And there we go. That is the Cruke fly. Shout out to my moderator on Twitch and my longtime friend Frosty, who was watching our live stream when we came up with this, and just took crab and fluke and blended it together, and I think it rolls off the tongue pretty nicely. Nothing revolutionary, just kind of taking your traditional sort of style crab flies and mixing them together, as well as some of the older juvenile fluke or flounder flies that I used to love seeing tied, like the Mark Sadati juvenile flounder fly and some other patterns out there. I think Steve Farrar had one, for instance. And the appearance is odd enough, I figured I would share it with you folks, as it is quite an interesting pattern where it kind of mixes two weighted flies that we use for striped bass in an interesting way. And throwing this in the pond here, you can see how it reacts in the pond in the backyard. The jig hook helps with turning the fly over and also giving it a more exaggerated up and down motion. And the way I would picture you fishing this, obviously you could fish it slowly and kind of hop it around the bottom, or you could fish it around drop-offs if you're trying to fish it as a crab fly. But if you're fishing as a fluke fly, you can have it sit on the bottom and then skirt it up really fast, run it maybe 10 or 15 feet, and then let it sink back down. If you've ever snorkeled as a kid and you've seen the juvenile fluke shooting off as you scare them. And when it sits still in the water, it has some interesting appearances as well. So I thought this fly was interesting enough to share with you folks. And as we kind of get back into the swing of making a ton of fly tying videos and fly fishing videos for the channel as summer is transitioning to fall, I figured it was a fun fly to share while we're still in summertime fishing mode. Well, my name is Mike from LI Flies Mike. We've been a little slow on the video front, but I've been quite busy doing some other things. We're finally getting back to it here, and I have a ton of different flies that I'd like to share on the channel, as well as different fly fishing videos and topics and discussions. Well, my name is Mike from LI Flies Mike. Thank you again for watching. We have a ton of different videos here on the channel, so make sure to go check it out if you're new. And thank you again to our YouTube members and our Twitch subs here on the channel that support the channel. It means a lot, and everyone that watches the channel here, we wouldn't be able to do without you folks. Alright, well, I'm Mike from LI Flies Mike. Have a great season out there this year, and have a great rest of your summer catching some fish. And until the next video, tight lines.